In the spring of 37 CE, Rome buzzed with a fervor that seemed to pulse through its ancient streets, from the marble grandeur of the Forum to the crowded tenements of the Subura. The city, weary from the dour and suspicious reign of Tiberius, yearned for renewal. The air was thick with anticipation, for a new emperor had ascended, a young man of only 24, whose very name carried the weight of a hero's legacy. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, was no ordinary princeps. He was the son of Germanicus, the beloved general whose memory still stirred the hearts of Romans, and Agrippina the elder, a woman whose lineage tied him to the divine Augustus himself. To the people, he was a golden sun, a beacon of hope promising to restore Rome's glory after years of paranoia and stagnation. The crowds roared as Caligula entered the city, his chariot gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. His boyish face, framed by curls, and his easy smile disarmed even the most cynical. "He is one of us," they whispered, recalling the tales of his childhood among the legions, where soldiers had nicknamed him Caligula, Little Boots, for the tiny military sandals he wore as a toddler. The Senate, too, exhaled in relief. Tiberius's reign had been a suffocating ordeal of purges and trials, with senators living in fear of accusation. Caligula, they hoped, would respect the old republican traditions, restoring the delicate balance between emperor and senate that Augustus had so carefully crafted. Yet, beneath this radiant surface, shadows stirred. Rome in 37 CE was a city of contradictions. The Republic was a fading memory, its institutions clinging to relevance under the weight of imperial power. The Senate, once the heart of Roman governance, now served more as a ceremonial body, its members acutely aware of their diminished role. The legions, loyal to the emperor's coin and charisma, held sway over the empire's stability, and the people, ever fickle, could turn from adoration to unrest with a single misstep. Caligula inherited this fragile equilibrium, a world where power was a performance and loyalty a fleeting currency. At first, Caligula played his part flawlessly. He declared an amnesty for those exiled under Tiberius, burning the records of their trials in a public gesture of reconciliation. He distributed gold to the Praetorian Guard, securing their allegiance, and showered the populace with lavish games, chariot races, and gladiatorial contests that filled the Circus Maximus with cheers. The treasury, flush from Tiberius's frugality, seemed bottomless, and Caligula spent freely to win hearts. "Let them love me," he reportedly said, his voice carrying the confidence of youth. But even in these early days there were whispers, rumors of a temper that flared without warning, of decisions that seemed impulsive, even reckless. Senators, accustomed to deference, noticed the first cracks. At a banquet to celebrate his ascension, Caligula laughed as he toasted to the new god of Rome, a jest that landed uneasily among men who revered tradition. His insistence on being addressed as Dominus, Lord, rather than the republican princeps, raised eyebrows. These were small signs, easily dismissed as the exuberance of youth, but they hinted at a deeper truth. Caligula saw himself not as a servant of Rome, but as its master. The Senate, still clinging to the illusion of influence, failed to see the storm brewing. They debated laws and honors, unaware that their authority was already slipping through their fingers like sand. The people, too, were blind to the gathering clouds. They reveled in the spectacles, in the free grain and wine, unaware that the treasury's reserves were dwindling. Caligula's generosity came at a cost, one that would soon fall upon the very institutions he seemed to champion. His military triumphs, promised with fanfare, were yet to materialize, and the legions, though placated with gold, watched their young emperor with wary eyes. Rome, in its euphoria, could not yet see the man who would unravel its fragile order, a man whose whims would shake the empire to its core. As the first year of his reign drew to a close, a subtle shift began. The golden sun started to cast a darker shadow. Stories circulated of senators summoned to the Palatine at midnight, only to find Caligula dancing in women's robes, laughing at their unease. His jests grew sharper, his demands more erratic. The city that had welcomed him as a savior began to sense something unsettling. a ruler who craved not just power, but divinity. The stage was set, and the echoes of his tyranny were about to reverberate through Rome, leaving scars that would endure for centuries. The Roman Senate, in the waning years of the first century, was a shadow of its republican glory, yet it remained the beating heart of tradition, a symbol of Rome's enduring legacy. Its members, draped in white togas edged with purple, gathered in the Curia Julia, their voices echoing off marble walls as they debated laws, honors, and the will of the gods. They were the stewards of Rome's past, guardians of an order that had once tamed a world. But under Caligula, this venerable institution began to crumble, its soul eroded by a young emperor who saw their authority not as a partner, but as a threat to his divine ambition. In the early months of his reign, Caligula had charmed the Senate with promises of partnership. He spoke of restoring their dignity, tarnished by Tiberius's purges, and senators dared to hope for a return to the days of Augustus, when emperor and senate ruled in harmony. But the facade soon cracked. Caligula's smiles turned to sneers, his promises to mockery. He began to treat the Senate not as a council of peers, but as a stage for his own performance. Stories spread of senators summoned to the Palatine Hill at dawn, only to find Caligula lounging in silks, demanding they kneel before him as if he were Jupiter himself. "You are my subjects," he would say, his voice sharp with amusement, "and I am your god." One infamous tale, recorded by Suetonius, tells of Caligula appointing his horse, Incitatus, as a consul. The story, likely exaggerated by hostile chroniclers, was no mere jest. It was a calculated insult. Whether true or not, the rumor alone humiliated the Senate, reducing their ancient office to a punchline. Senators whispered in private, their faces pale with indignation, but none dared challenge him openly. To do so was to invite ruin. Caligula's spies were everywhere, and his temper was as unpredictable as a summer storm. A single word could mean exile, or worse, a blade in the night. His contempt went beyond theatrics. Caligula bypassed senatorial approval for key appointments, filling Rome's governorships and priesthoods with loyalists who owed everything to him. The Senate, once a gatekeeper of power, found itself sidelined, its decrees ignored or overturned on a whim. When a senator dared to question a lavish aqueduct project, Caligula's response was chilling. He ordered the man to run beside his chariot through the streets, a public spectacle of submission. The message was clear: oppose the emperor and you would be broken. The financial toll of Caligula's rule further weakened the Senate's standing. His predecessors had left a treasury brimming with coin, but Caligula's appetite for grandeur was insatiable. He commissioned golden statues of himself, hosted gladiatorial games that lasted weeks, and built pleasure barges on Lake Nemi, their hulls adorned with mosaics and bronze. To fund this excess, he demanded the Senate impose new taxes on marriages, inheritances, even prostitutes, measures that sparked resentment among the people. The senators, forced to enforce these unpopular decrees, became scapegoats for Caligula's profligacy. "Why must we pay for his madness?" a merchant muttered in the Forum, his words echoing a growing sentiment. The Senate's legitimacy, already fragile, began to erode in the eyes of the very citizens they served. This erosion was not merely political, it was personal. Senators lived in fear, their nights haunted by the dread of a midnight summons. Caligula delighted in their unease, hosting banquets where he would toast their health one moment and hint at their execution the next. "I can have your head with a nod," he once remarked to a trembling consul, laughing as the man spilled his wine. The Senate, once a bastion of Roman gravitas, became a house of whispers, its members cowed into silence. The old republican spirit, which had defied kings and conquerors, was suffocating under the weight of one man's tyranny. The consequences of this assault rippled far beyond Caligula's reign. By humiliating the Senate, he set a dangerous precedent. The emperor was above all, answerable to none. The delicate balance Augustus had crafted, a facade of republican governance under imperial rule, began to collapse. Later emperors, from Nero to Domitian, would follow Caligula's lead, treating the Senate as a relic rather than a partner. The institution that had guided Rome through centuries of triumph was reduced to a shadow, its members little more than courtiers in a despot's court. Yet the senators were not blameless. Some, driven by ambition or fear, enabled Caligula's excesses, hoping to secure favor or survival. Others, too weak to resist, bowed to his demands, their silence a betrayal of the ideals they swore to uphold. In their compliance, they sowed the seeds of their own irrelevance. The Senate's erosion under Caligula was not just a loss of power, it was a loss of soul, a fracture in the very foundation of Roman governance. As 38 CE gave way to 39, the Senate's plight grew bleaker. Caligula's whims grew wilder, his demands more outrageous. He declared himself a living god, ordering temples to honor his divinity, and the Senate, stripped of courage, complied. In the Curia, where Cicero had once thundered against tyranny, men now spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the shadows. The heart of Rome was faltering, and the emperor's laughter echoed through its halls, a sound that promised not renewal but ruin. The legions of Rome were more than soldiers. They were the sinew and steel of an empire that stretched from the misty hills of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt. Their loyalty was the bedrock of imperial power, a bond forged in blood, gold, and the promise of glory. In 37 CE, as Caligula took the throne, the legions stood ready to serve the son of Germanicus, their beloved general whose memory still lingered in the camps. The Praetorian Guard, elite protectors of the emperor, swore oaths to their little boots, expecting a leader who would honor their service. But Caligula, with his reckless ambition and erratic whims, would test that loyalty until it frayed, planting seeds of discord that would shake the empire's foundations. At first, Caligula understood the legion's importance. He rode into Rome with the Praetorians at his side, their polished armor glinting in the sun, a symbol of his unassailable power. He distributed generous donatives, sacks of silver denarii to secure their allegiance, a gesture that echoed Augustus's wisdom. The soldiers cheered, their voices carrying across the Tiber, believing their young emperor would lead them to triumphs worthy of his father's name. But Caligula's military ambitions were not those of a disciplined commander. They were the fevered dreams of a man who saw himself as a god, not a general. In 39 CE, Caligula embarked on a campaign to conquer Britannia, a land shrouded in mystery at the empire's edge. The legions marched north with anticipation, their standards held high, expecting a war that would carve their names into history. But what unfolded was a farce that would haunt the annals of Rome. At the shores of Gaul, Caligula halted the advance. Instead of crossing the sea, he ordered his men to wage war against Neptune himself, commanding them to collect seashells as spoils of the ocean. The soldiers, hardened by years of battle, stood dumbfounded, their boots sinking into the sand as they gathered shells under their emperor's manic gaze. "A triumph for Rome," Caligula proclaimed, but to the legions it was a humiliation, a mockery of their honor. Back in Rome, whispers of this bizarre campaign spread through the barracks. The legions, accustomed to clear purpose and tangible victories, began to question their leader. Caligula's erratic behavior extended beyond the battlefield. His paranoia, fueled by rumors of plots, led to purges that struck at the heart of the military hierarchy. Respected officers, men who had served under Germanicus, were accused of disloyalty on the flimsiest grounds. Some were executed, their heads displayed on the Palatine as warnings. Others were exiled, their families stripped of status. The centurions, the backbone of the legions, watched in silence, their trust in their emperor eroding with each unjust decree. The Praetorian Guard, closest to the emperor's side, felt the sting of his caprice most acutely. These elite soldiers, tasked with protecting the princeps, were not immune to his wrath. Caligula's demands grew increasingly erratic: midnight inspections, lavish banquets where he mocked their discipline, even rumors that he planned to replace them with foreign mercenaries. The Praetorians, whose loyalty had been bought with gold, began to see their emperor not as a protector, but as a liability. "He trusts no one," a grizzled prefect muttered in the shadows of the Castra Praetoria, "and so we trust him less." Caligula's failure to maintain the legion's loyalty was compounded by his neglect of their material needs. The treasury, drained by his extravagant projects, golden statues, pleasure barges, endless spectacles could not sustain the donatives that kept the soldiers content. Tiberius had hoarded wealth, but Caligula spent it like water, leaving little for the legion's pay or veterans' pensions. In the camps, murmurs of discontent grew louder. "Germanicus would never have left us wanting," a legionary grumbled, his voice low to avoid the emperor's spies. The memory of Caligula's father, who had shared their hardships on the Rhine, stood in stark contrast to the son's indifference. This growing disaffection had consequences that rippled far beyond Caligula's reign. The Praetorian Guard, humiliated and alienated, would play a pivotal role in his downfall. In 41 CE, it was their blades that ended his life, a brutal act that revealed a new truth. The military could unmake an emperor as easily as it made one. This precedent was a crack in the empire's armor, one that would widen in the chaotic year of the four emperors in 69 CE, when legions and their commanders vied openly for the throne. Caligula's failure to secure military loyalty did not just weaken his rule. It destabilized the very system that held Rome together. The soldiers' disillusionment was more than a matter of gold or glory. It was personal. They had marched for Rome, bled for its emperors, and buried their comrades under foreign skies. To be led by a man who treated their service as a jest, who saw their loyalty as his divine right, was a betrayal. In the flickering torchlight of their camps, they spoke of Germanicus, of a time when leadership meant sacrifice, not spectacle. Caligula's actions turned their pride to resentment, their duty to doubt. As 40 CE dawned, the legions and the praetorians watched their emperor with wary eyes. His laughter, once a symbol of youthful exuberance, now carried a menacing edge. The loyalty that had greeted his ascension was fraying, replaced by a simmering discontent that would soon boil over. The empire's steel was bending, and the man who wielded it seemed blind to the fracture he was creating, a fracture that would echo through the centuries, threatening the very heart of Rome. Rome, in the year 40 CE, was a city caught in a paradox, dazzled by spectacle, yet suffocated by dread. The streets thrummed with the echoes of Caligula's reign, the roar of crowds at the Circus Maximus, the clink of coins changing hands, the distant screams of those who crossed the emperor's whims. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, once the golden son of Rome, had become its tormentor. The people who had cheered his ascension now whispered his name with unease, their adoration replaced by a creeping fear that seeped into every corner of the eternal city. Caligula's tyranny, once masked by generosity, now stood naked, and its shadow fell heavily on a populace that could no longer ignore the cost of his rule. In the early days, Caligula had won the people's hearts with extravagance. He staged chariot races that lasted from dawn to dusk, gladiatorial contests where blood soaked the arena, and feasts where wine flowed like the Tiber. The granaries were opened and bread was distributed freely, a gesture that recalled the benevolence of Augustus. "He is our savior," a baker in the Subura had proclaimed, raising a cup to the emperor's health. But the treasury, once swollen with Tiberius's hoarded wealth, was not infinite. As Caligula's spectacles grew grander, golden statues erected in his likeness, pleasure barges floating on Lake Nemi, banquets where guests dined on peacock tongues, the coffers began to empty. The people, unaware of the looming price, reveled in the moment, blind to the storm gathering on the horizon. The first cracks appeared when new taxes were levied. The Senate, under Caligula's orders, imposed duties on everything from weddings to tavern earnings, squeezing the life from Rome's bustling markets. Artisans cursed as their profits dwindled. Mothers wept as dowries became burdens. The emperor's generosity, it seemed, was a mirage, paid for by the sweat and coin of the very people he claimed to uplift. Yet Caligula's appetite for grandeur only grew. He commissioned temples to himself, declaring his divinity with a fervor that shocked Rome's traditionalists. In the sacred precincts of the Forum, where Jupiter and Mars were worshipped, statues of Caligula now loomed, their marble eyes staring down at a city that no longer recognized its own gods. Fear took root through acts of arbitrary cruelty. Caligula's temper, once a fleeting spark, became a wildfire. Stories spread of dinner guests forced to watch their sons executed for a perceived slight, their bodies left in the streets as a warning. A merchant who grumbled about taxes was dragged to the Palatine, his tongue cut out before a jeering crowd. Suetonius recounts how Caligula, at a gladiatorial show, ordered a section of the audience thrown to the beasts when the arena ran short of prisoners. Whether true or embroidered by hostile pens, these tales painted a portrait of a ruler who delighted in terror. "Let them hate me, so long as they fear me," he reportedly said, his words a chilling prophecy of the city's mood. The emperor's self-deification deepened the unease. He demanded that Romans worship him as a living god, a notion that clashed with the Republic's ancient disdain for kings and divine rulers. Temples were rededicated, priests forced to offer sacrifices to Caligula's name. In the Jewish quarter, where monotheism held sway, his orders to place his statue in the Temple of Jerusalem sparked outrage, narrowly averted by desperate diplomacy. To the Roman masses, raised on tales of Romulus and the stoic virtues of their ancestors, this was not just blasphemy, it was an assault on their identity. "He is no longer one of us," a priestess whispered in the shadow of the Temple of Vesta, her voice trembling with both fear and defiance. This climate of terror eroded the trust that had once bound emperor and people. The Pax Romana, the peace that Augustus had promised, felt like a distant memory. In the markets, vendors lowered their voices when speaking of the emperor. In the insulae, families bolted their doors at night, fearing the Praetorian Guard's sudden knocks. The city's pulse quickened with paranoia, as neighbors turned informant to save their own skins. Caligula's spies, real or imagined, seemed to lurk in every shadow, and the line between loyalty and survival blurred. The unrest fueled conspiracies. In the darkened halls of noble houses, senators and equestrians plotted in secret, their whispers mingling with the flicker of oil lamps. The Praetorian Guard, once Caligula's protectors, began to listen to these murmurs, their own grievances stoking their resolve. The people, though powerless to act directly, fed the growing discontent with their silent resentment. A butcher in the Forum Boarium, sharpening his cleaver, muttered, "Even gods can bleed." The city was a tinderbox, and Caligula's tyranny was the spark. The consequences of this fear were profound. The public's alienation weakened the social fabric that held Rome together. The emperor, once a symbol of unity, became a source of division, his actions sowing distrust that lingered long after his reign. The conspiracies that simmered in 40 CE would boil over in 41, culminating in Caligula's assassination, a brutal act that revealed the fragility of imperial authority. The people's outrage, born of fear and betrayal, set a precedent for unrest that would plague later emperors, from Nero's excesses to the civil wars of 69 CE. As Caligula's reign neared its end, Rome was a city transformed, not by glory, but by dread. The golden sun had become a specter, his laughter a harbinger of doom. The people who had once cheered him now prayed for deliverance, their voices stifled, but their resolve hardening. The eternal city, built on 7 hills, stood on the edge of a precipice, its future uncertain as the emperor's madness cast a long, dark shadow. The reign of Caligula, though brief, cast a shadow far longer than its 4 years. By 41 CE, Rome was a city transformed, not by the glory of conquest or the stability of wise governance, but by the scars of tyranny. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, once hailed as the son of Germanicus, had become a symbol of unchecked power, his actions carving deep wounds into the empire's institutions, its legions, and its people. These wounds did not heal with his death. They festered, their echoes reverberating through the Julio-Claudian dynasty and beyond, setting the stage for Rome's gradual decline. Caligula's legacy was not merely a cautionary tale. It was a catalyst, a fracture in the empire's foundation that would widen with time. The erosion of the Senate's authority, begun under Caligula's contemptuous gaze, marked a turning point in Roman governance. The Curia Julia, once a bastion of republican ideals, had been reduced to a stage for the emperor's whims. Senators, humiliated and cowed, learned to bow rather than debate, their voices silenced by fear of retribution. Caligula's insistence on divine honors and his bypassing of senatorial protocols stripped the institution of its dignity, setting a precedent for autocracy. When Nero later burned Rome and blamed Christians, or when Domitian declared himself Lord and God, they walked a path Caligula had paved. The Senate's decline weakened the empire's ability to govern its vast territories, as provinces grew accustomed to looking to the emperor alone for authority, not the collective wisdom of Rome's elite. The military, too, bore the marks of Caligula's reign. His alienation of the legions and the Praetorian Guard had shattered the trust that bound soldiers to their emperor. The seashell campaign, the purges of loyal officers, the failure to reward their service, these were not mere missteps, but betrayals that turned the empire's steel into a double-edged sword. The Praetorians' role in Caligula's assassination in 41 CE was a stark warning. The military, once a servant of the state, could now unmake its masters. This shift reverberated through the year of the four emperors in 69 CE, when legions crowned and discarded emperors in a frenzy of civil war. Caligula's failure to secure their loyalty exposed a truth that would haunt Rome. An emperor's power rested on the swords of those he could not fully control. The Roman populace, once united by the promise of the Pax Romana, emerged from Caligula's reign fractured by fear. His spectacles, taxes, and acts of cruelty had turned adoration into resentment, planting seeds of distrust that grew into rebellion. The conspiracies that ended his life were fueled not just by senators or soldiers, but by a city that could no longer bear his weight. This public alienation lingered, undermining the Julio-Claudian dynasty. When Nero faced revolt, or when Claudius struggled to assert legitimacy, they grappled with a populace that had learned to question the divine right of emperors. Caligula's reign taught Rome's people that even gods could fall, a lesson that emboldened resistance and sowed instability. Yet the echoes of Caligula's tyranny reached beyond Rome's marble temples and dusty frontiers. His reign was a mirror held up to power itself, reflecting the dangers of a single man's unchecked will. The institutions he weakened, the Senate, the military, the social contract, were the pillars that had sustained Rome through centuries of conquest. By undermining them, Caligula set in motion a slow unraveling, a process that would culminate centuries later in the empire's fall. The economic strain of his extravagance foreshadowed the financial crises that plagued later emperors. The military's growing power presaged the Praetorian dominance that destabilized the 3rd century. The public's fear and disillusionment eroded the unity that had made Rome invincible. Caligula did not destroy the empire, but he cracked its foundation, leaving it vulnerable to the storms that followed. These lessons resonate beyond the ancient world. Caligula's story is a warning etched in history's pages, a reminder of what happens when power becomes a performance of ego rather than a duty to serve. Modern parallels abound. Leaders who dismantle institutions for personal gain, alienate their supporters, or rule through fear rather than trust. The Roman Senate's capitulation mirrors the fragility of democratic norms when confronted by authoritarianism. The legion's disloyalty reflects the peril of neglecting those who wield a nation's strength. The people's fear underscores the cost of breaking the social contract. Caligula's reign, though distant, speaks to any era where power is wielded without accountability. His legacy is not just one of destruction, but of revelation. Caligula exposed the empire's vulnerabilities, forcing Rome to confront the limits of its imperial dream. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, shaken by his rule, limped on under Claudius and Nero, but the cracks remained. Each successive emperor faced a Rome less resilient, less united, less certain of its destiny. The eternal city would endure for centuries, its aqueducts flowing and its legions marching. But the shadow of Caligula's tyranny lingered, a quiet reminder that even the mightiest empires can falter when led by a hand that knows only its own desires. As we look back on Caligula's reign, we see not just a madman or a monster, but a catalyst, a figure whose brief, tempestuous rule revealed the fragility beneath Rome's grandeur. His actions, reckless and ruthless, sent ripples through time, shaping the empire's trajectory and offering a timeless lesson. Power, when divorced from responsibility, becomes a force not of creation, but of collapse. The echoes of his tyranny still whisper to us, urging vigilance in the face of those who would crown themselves gods. By January 41 CE, Rome was a city on the edge, its streets heavy with the weight of fear and betrayal. Caligula, the emperor who had once been hailed as a savior, had become a specter haunting the eternal city. His reign, now in its 4th year, had turned the Senate into a shadow, the legions into a simmering threat, and the populace into a silent, seething mass. The Palatine Hill, where he held court, was no longer a seat of power, but a stage for paranoia, where every glance was suspect, every whisper a potential plot. The end was coming, and it would be swift, brutal, and born of the very chaos Caligula had sown. The conspiracy that would end Caligula's life took root in the shadows of his own making. Senators, stripped of dignity, nursed their grudges in secret. The Praetorian Guard, once his protectors, had grown weary of his insults and erratic demands. Even the common people, crushed by taxes and terror, whispered of deliverance. The spark came from men like Cassius Chaerea, a grizzled Praetorian prefect whose scars testified to a lifetime of service. Chaerea, mocked by Caligula for his voice and manhood, burned with a rage that mirrored the city's own. Alongside him were senators like Annius Vinicianus and a web of conspirators who saw in Caligula's death the only path to Rome's salvation. On January 24th, 41 CE, the plot unfolded in the Cryptoporticus, a dimly lit corridor beneath the Palatine. Caligula, fresh from a theatrical performance, strode through the passage, his golden robes trailing behind him, unaware of the blades waiting in the dark. Chaerea struck first, his sword biting into the emperor's flesh, followed by a flurry of blows from others. "I live!" Caligula screamed, according to Cassius Dio, but his cries were drowned by the fury of his assassins. Blood pooled on the marble, staining the legacy of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His wife, Milonia Caesonia, and infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, were hunted down soon after, their deaths sealing the erasure of his line. The golden sun was dead, and Rome held its breath. The aftermath was chaos. The Senate, sensing a chance to reclaim power, debated restoring the Republic, their voices rising in the Curia with a fervor not heard in decades. But the Praetorians, ever pragmatic, had other plans. They found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, cowering behind a curtain and proclaimed him emperor, their swords ensuring his ascension. The Republic's flicker of hope was snuffed out. The empire would endure, but under a new master. Claudius, frail and underestimated, inherited a Rome scarred by Caligula's tyranny, a city where trust was a luxury and power a precarious game. Caligula's assassination was more than the end of a reign. It was a revelation of Rome's fragility. The Praetorians' role in his death and Claudius's rise showed that the military, not the Senate or the people, now held the empire's reins. This shift, born of Caligula's alienation of his protectors, set a precedent that would echo through the centuries, from the civil wars of 69 CE to the 3rd century's parade of soldier emperors. The Senate's dreams of restoration faded, their authority further diminished by the bloodshed on the Palatine. The people, though relieved, learned a bitter lesson. Emperors could fall, but the system that birthed them endured. The echoes of Caligula's tyranny lingered in the Julio-Claudian dynasty and beyond. Claudius, wary of his nephew's fate, ruled with caution, but the cracks remained. Nero's excesses, Galba's weakness, Otho's ambition, all bore traces of the instability Caligula had unleashed. The empire's decline, though centuries away, was seated in these fractures. A Senate too weak to govern, a military too strong to control, a populace too cynical to unite. Caligula's 4 years were a brief storm, but their devastation reshaped Rome's destiny, proving that even a single ruler's madness could tilt the scales of history. His story is a warning carved in marble and blood. Caligula's reign exposed the dangers of power unchecked, of institutions hollowed out, of loyalty squandered. It speaks to any age where leaders prioritize ego over duty, where fear supplants trust, where the foundations of governance are eroded by caprice. The Roman Forum, with its temples and arches, still stands as a testament to an empire's grandeur, but it also whispers of its flaws, of a city that could be brought low by one man's hubris. Caligula, in his brief, tempestuous rule, was not just an emperor, but a mirror, reflecting the perils of tyranny and the fragility of even the mightiest realms. Today, as we walk the ruins of Rome or govern nations of our own, Caligula's legacy urges vigilance. Power, when wielded without accountability, becomes a force of ruin. Institutions, when undermined, crumble. Loyalty, when betrayed, turns to rebellion. The echoes of his tyranny are not confined to history's pages. They resonate in every era, reminding us that the fall of empires begins not with invasions or disasters, but with the choices of those who lead. Caligula's Rome fell silent on that January day, but its lessons still speak, urging us to guard against the shadows of tyranny in our own time.